what I'd like to describe to you now is something I call the two-part brain. So when you came into my office, you made the statement, I want to stop doing this. I don't want to look at pornography anymore. It's frustrating to me. I've made a commitment a number of times to stop doing it, and then I end up doing it again. And what I would say to you is that you're really of two minds of this thing. There is a part of you that wants to stop, but there's also this other part that wants to continue on with this behavior. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. It's best described by this diagram on the board, which I call the two-part brain. This red portion here of the brain is something called the limbic system. The limbic system is our instinctive brain. It's very closely tied to our brain stem and something called the autonomic nervous system. To show you just how instinctive and unconscious this part of the brain is, an example is if you go outside and it's 10 degrees outside and you don't have a coat on, what does your body do? It begins to shiver. Or if you go outside and it's 110 degrees outside, your body sweats. That's the body's attempt in order to keep the internal organs at a certain temperature so that they will survive. But do you consciously tell your body to do those things? So when you go outside and it's 10 degrees and your body starts to shiver, do you consciously say, I better start shivering now? No, you don't do that. It's the same thing, if you've been shivering and you try to tell yourself not to do it, it just continues to happen. You don't have control over that really with our higher functioning brain called the prefrontal cortex that I'll explain in a minute. But this instinctive part of the brain, when I say instinctive, we're talking about things like need for air, food, water, and sexuality is also hooked in the limbic part of the brain. The limbic system is very impulsive. It simply responds to things in the environment, and it has three very powerful prime directives. The first prime directive is to survive. Okay? It will do whatever it needs to do in order to make sure that we survive. That's its main purpose. For example, when you were young, if you ever came across touching a stove for the first time or a fire, you experienced being burnt, a memory was created in the limbic system in a specific place called the hippocampus, which is located in the limbic system, to make sure that we learn from that so we don't continue to do a behavior that would be detrimental to us. The second prime directive of the limbic system is to avoid pain. The limbic system looks at pain, either emotional or physical, as a threat to survival. That's what it interprets it as, a threat to survival. And the third prime directive is to seek pleasure. Now, an important part of understanding the limbic system is that it's not really rational and logical. It has no guilt or no remorse. It's not built to do those things. It's the type of brain that's largely functioning in an animal, like a lion or a tiger. Now, if a lion or a tiger gets hungry, what does it do? It simply goes and hunts, and it eats. It doesn't sit around and reason and think about things. It simply is instinctive, and it goes in order to survive. Now, what makes us different than the animals, say like a lion or a tiger, is we have this other part of the brain called the neocortex, and more specifically, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where our cognition and our higher reasoning capacities are. This is the part that feels guilt. This is the part that is logical and rational and makes plans, higher functioning decisions, can do mathematics and so forth. Now, this is how, I'm going to explain to you how an addiction can develop. When, typically speaking, when an individual, I've heard so many stories from individuals who have been in my office, as I mentioned in the past, that I've spent thousands of hours doing this work. The stories are very similar. Somewhere between the ages of 8 and 12 years old is generally when an individual comes across pornography for the first time or has their first sexual encounter. Usually they'll find a magazine, the stories will find a magazine in a field, in an uncle's house, cousin's house, sleepover, whatever. But what happens, the first experience with pornography of seeing nudity, it will strongly impact the limbic part of the brain, because again, that's where our sexual desires are housed. And a memory is created here. Again, the hippocampus, the part that stores certain survival memories, it's just templated there. And one of the acronyms that we use in treatment, one of many, is BLAST. BLAST stands for being bored, lonely, angry, stressed, or tired. Now, when we're in any one of these emotional states, the survival part of the brain, if it's painful enough, it acts and interprets the stress as a threat to survival, and so it instinctively will go on a search for something that is pleasurable. And where do you think it goes to? It simply will search around in here for something that will take it out of pain. And sexuality being one of our core instinctive drives, it will create a memory, create a desire to go and participate in that activity again because it was so pleasurable. Now, if a person continues to do this behavior over and over, you start to develop what's called neural network pathways, and it becomes very entrenched. Now, generally speaking also, when an individual comes across pornography for the first time as a young person, they have confusing feelings about it. There's a part of them that feels great pleasure at seeing the images, and then there's a part that feels like, this isn't really right. But they don't go talk to anyone about it. I've rarely had an individual say to me, well, I went home and told my mom and dad that I saw pornography for the first time today. It just doesn't happen very frequently. And so you start to develop this cycle of keeping things secret. And as the process continues over and over again, as I mentioned, it becomes a stronger neural connection, and so the tendency to go back to that behavior is enhanced. So now, sometimes after years and years, it will take an individual till their life starts to break down that they'll end up in my office. And what is the interesting thing about the limbic part of the brain, although it's very, very powerful and instinctive, it's not very smart in some ways. What happens is it starts to interpret the message that looking at pornography or masturbating is a survival need to learn how to deal with the emotional stressors of life. So what will happen, it starts to develop this thing called a craving. Only those who truly have an addiction or a loved one who has an addiction can get some sense of what a craving really is. A craving is this powerful, instinctive, gnawing need to go back to participate in behavior. It's exactly the same thing if it's heroin addiction, cocaine, methamphetamine, and so forth. Alcohol, it does exactly the same thing. Whenever the brain gets templated to, it will create strong cravings and desires to go back to. And then there's also cross-addiction issues where one will trade for another. But anyway, so another thing that's interesting, this 0.003 seconds is how long it's been determined that the visual part of this can interpret information. When we take information in through our eyes, the limbic system is triggered in 0.003 seconds. And so what happens is that information, it kicks off something, chemicals already start to flow, and then another part of the limbic system is called the thalamus, which takes this information and then transfers it to our higher functioning brain, or the prefrontal cortex. And so it's always like a person is triggered, and they're triggered, it's already off and running before the information is transferred to the prefrontal cortex, where our braking system